HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, are institutions of higher education in the United States. In Georgia, they were founded in 1890 by Savannah State University. The historically black colleges integrates black students' education. HBCUs were established to serve the educational needs of black African Americans. Prior to the time of their establishment, and for many years afterwards, blacks were generally denied. As a result, HBCUs became the principal means for providing post-secondary education to black Americans. They were established before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the intention of primarily serving the African American community, which leads to racial segregation. Racial segregation is a systematic separation of people based off their race or other ethnic groups in daily life. Segregation can involve spatial separation of the races and mandatory use of different institutions such as public places, schools, restaurants, and hospitals by people of different races. In Georgia during the 1960s, there were segregation academies. Segregation academies were private schools in the United States that opened after 1954 during the 1960s and the 1970s as a way for white parents to avoid the desegregation of public schools as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling Brown v. Board of Education. Over half a century of the de jure racial segregation in education came to an end on May 17, 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board of Education. Although the Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal due to the institution of slavery, this statement was not to be grounded in the law of the United States until after the Civil War. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified and finally put an end to slavery. Moreover, the 14th Amendment strengthened the legal rights of newly freed slaves by stating, among other things, that no state shall deprive anyone of either due process of law or of the equal protection of the law. Finally, the 15th Amendment further strengthened the legal rights of newly freed slaves by prohibiting states from denying anyone the right to vote due to race. Despite these amendments, African Americans were often treated differently than whites in many parts of the country, especially in the South. In fact, many state legislators enacted law that led to legally mandate segregation of the races. In other words, the laws of many states decreed that blacks and whites could not use the same public facilities, ride the same buses, or attend the same schools. These laws came to know the Jim Crow laws. Although many people felt that these laws were unjust, it was just not until the 1890s that they were directly challenged in court. In 1982, an African-American man named Homer Plessy refused to give up his seat to a white man on a train in New Orleans, as he required to do by Louisiana state law. For this action, he was arrested. Plessy contended that Louisiana law separating blacks from whites on trains violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, decided to fight his arrest in court. By 1896, his case made all the way to the United States Supreme Court. By a vote of 8-1, the Supreme Court ruled against Plessy. Jim Crow laws in the U.S. history and any of the laws that enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Jim Crow was the name of a ministerial routine, actually jumped Jim Crow. The term became a derogatory epithet for African Americans and designation for their segregated life. State and local laws that enforce racial segregation in the southern United States all were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the white Democratic-dominated state legislators after the Reconstruction period. The laws were enforced until 1965. An HBCU could segregate by gender, but it doesn't necessarily have to. For example, Spelman or Morehouse. Spelman being an all-women's college and Morehouse being an all-men's college. Savannah State, for example, integrates both genders. Despite attempts to shroud such positions in the language of integration, they are at odds with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s stance on HBCUs and the role they should play in post-Jim Crow America. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., an alumnus of the Morehouse College, consistently stressed that eradicating segregation in higher education was not about getting rid of HBCUs. As he once explained, HBCUs were segregated, but they were not segregated institutions. It is important to understand the meanings of term King used. A segregated institution is an instrument used by one race to uphold its political, economic, and/or social dominance through the methods that work to the detriment of other races. A man named William Edward Bogart Du Bois was an African-American educator, historian, sociologist, and a social activist who pointedly addressed the issues of racial discrimination. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and grew up in a relatively tolerant and integrated community. And after completing graduate work at the University of Berlin and Harvard, where he was the first African-American to earn a doctorate, he became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at the Atlanta University and co-founded NAACP. Some people cannot understand the role and purpose of HBCUs, and that is because they assume that Black institutions are inferior. This assumption is tied to a deep racism that permeates our nation. That is, Black equals inferior. Others assume that HBCUs segregate when in fact they are more often diverse and make up students, faculty, and staff. There are over 100 HBCUs in the United States, including both public and private institutions. Of these remaining HBCU institutions in the United States, 27 offer doctoral programs, 52 offer master's programs, 83 offer bachelor degrees programs, and 38 offer associate degrees. The Higher Education Act of 1965 established a program for direct federal grants to HBCUs, including federal aid to Part B institutions. Some colleges with predominantly Black students were not classified as HBCUs because they were founded after the implementation of the Brown v. Board of Education rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court and the Higher Education Act of 1965. In 1980, Jimmy Carter signed an executive order to distribute adequate resources and funds to strengthen the nation's public and private HBCUs. His executive order created the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities, which is a federally funded program that operates within the U.S. Department of Education.